want to get online, I need a computer.
So I finally pulled the trigger on buying myself a VR headset. To be honest, it's been a desire of mine for a while. I've always been enamored with the dream of virtual reality, of being able to put some goggles over your eyes and be completely transported to somewhere different. And what with the circumstances over the last year or so, I found myself emboldened to finally double down and make the dream a reality. In terms of the headset that I chose, I opted for the Oculus Quest 2. Now, I know a lot of people have some misgivings, what with the Facebook account integration, and really it's an issue that I also grappled with. But eventually I came to the realization that I don't really use Facebook all that much, maintain a bare minimum presence, and in terms of the data shared, if it ultimately helps Zuckerberg finally act like a real human being, well, it seems like it's for a good cause. Ethical quandaries aside, slipping on the headset and getting it set up was a relatively painless endeavor, the minimal amount of tweakage required to adjust it for my particular visual range, and before you know it, I was off to the races. Naturally, the first VR experiences I dabbled in are relatively well known for the most part. First was Beatsaber. I'm a sucker for a good rhythm game, and there is just something tangibly awesome about holding these not quite lightsabers in your hands, slicing the blocks to the beat. After I drank my fill with Beatsaber, I was swiftly on to Super Hot VR, a game I had been itching to try out for an age, and I can easily see why it's regarded as a marquee VR title, something that you absolutely must try out if you own a VR headset. Requiring all sorts of physicality, you'll be hitting the deck, peeking out from behind cover, returning blind fire. It really gives you a workout, surprisingly so, and all the while making you feel like a bona fide slow-mo action badass. But despite the manic glee experienced with these more premium VR experiences, I couldn't help but notice that there was this nagging desire somewhere in the back of my mind. A desire made manifest with the words, "I wonder what Doom is like in VR." First things first, Doom is not available as standard on the Oculus Quest, be it through the Oculus Store via the headset or through the Steam VR selection, which you can gain access to using a link cable. Instead, with a minor amount of tweakage, you can enable your headset to access something called SideQuest. This essentially throws the doors wide open with regards to available VR experiences and, of course, grants you access to Quest Z Doom. Naturally, this does not come preloaded with the original Doom and Doom 2 WAD files. Those you will need to provide for yourself, but for those of you that can't even stretch that far, it does actually come preloaded with free Doom, so at the very least you can get a quick and dirty Doom experience through those. For me, however, the real deal was the only choice, and after a relatively simple setup process, I was suddenly in the shoes of Doom Guy, standing at the entrance to Hangar. As you might imagine, feeling physically present within one of these levels that I've spent so long playing via keyboard and mouse through the medium of a monitor is strange as heck, doubly so when you throw in the concept of movement. For those of you unaware, you don't generally walk about when wearing a VR headset. That's a recipe for injury and disaster. Instead, you'll typically stand still and use one of several possible locomotion methods in order to navigate a space. One of the more popular methods seems to be teleportation, allowing you to throw a waypoint that you will then instantaneously blink to, and that is indeed available here, but for some reason I just couldn't figure out how to get it working. Instead, I controlled my forward movement and strafing with the left analog stick on my controller, while turning, on the other hand, quite literally in fact, was controlled by the right analog stick, and this, as you can plainly see, snaps in varied increments, and this is to avoid nausea, something that I was eager to explore my limits of, and in testing I discovered that making it as smooth as possible was actually quite nausea-inducing indeed. Very uncomfortable, and this is coming from someone that typically doesn't have all that much issue with motion sickness. Ultimately, however, if I had to describe the sensation of moving about these levels once I had my preferences dialed in, it was less the feeling of being able to take a stroll around these levels and more like I was strapped to the top of a hoverboard and being gently rolled about. Think Doom guy on a Segway and you're probably in the right kind of ballpark. But Icarus, I hear you cry. Enough about the movement. What's it like to shoot things in the face? And to that I'd reply, quite visceral indeed, especially when coupled with the pre-packaged gore mod and the 3D weapon models, which you've no doubt noticed by now. These, in my opinion, are crucial in providing that extra sense of tangibility when it comes to wielding and firing a weapon. And of course there is also a little bit of extra haptic feedback courtesy of vibration in the controller itself. Unfortunately, at this point, the feedback via vibration seems to be universal across all weapons, and personally, I see this as something that could easily benefit from a little bit of enhancement. Bigger weapons, obviously, delivering much more significant feedback. For those of you not all that particularly enamored with the 3D weapon models on display here, you should know that you do in fact have a choice. The more realistic models here offset by a selection of voxel-based weapon models, and when it comes down to personal preference, I prefer the voxel-based models. When it comes to the subject of aim, the weapons will typically follow wherever you're aiming, your controller assisted with the presence of a laser tracking dot. For those of you who wish to be a little bit more hardcore with your shooting, you can turn the tracking dot off, and provided you got the right kind of weapon model, use the iron sights when it comes to lining up your shots. Something else that you can take advantage of when it comes to accuracy is the ability to two-hand your weapons. In normal play, you'll simply be waving around your gun with your right hand, but you can also brace it for a steadier shot with your left, and this is achieved by holding the grip button on that controller, which essentially gloms it onto a certain part of the weapon at hand. If you think of the pump-action shotgun, for example, the left hand will now be holding it underneath the barrel. And this works wonders in terms of immersion, in terms of tactile sensation, and it is genuinely useful when it comes to producing a steadier aim. The positioning itself is a little inconsistent across the gamut of weapons itself. For example, if you're rocking the more realistic weapon models, the grip for the chain gun isn't where your left hand sticks. It's still in the same position as the pump-action shotgun, and I imagine it'd be tricky to try and tailor that for each particular weapon, but it would certainly be something nice to see in future updates. When it comes to the potential advantages afforded to you by playing Doom via the medium of VR, something that certainly comes to mind is the freedom of aim, the freedom with which you can angle your weapons. It's really only limited to the angles with which you can contort your arm, and as a result this allows you to circumvent some elements of level geometry that may have originally been intended to prevent you from outright decimating a room. Not to say that the VR experience here utterly trivializes the original Doom gameplay experience. I mean, sure, we've got advantages with aim, but overall I feel like it meshes together quite well. One thing that certainly came to mind was the turn speed. You might think it'd put me at somewhat of a disadvantage, but I couldn't help but remember that back in the day, turning speed was actually pretty sluggish in Doom. The placement of enemies and the pacing of gameplay designed around that. So, mercifully, I didn't feel overtly OP. I didn't feel that I was at any point overtly at a disadvantage either. It managed to toe a pretty nice line, right down the middle. A real enjoyable experience, so much so that I felt compelled to do the entirety of Episode 1 through VR. Naturally, I had to break it up into a few parts. My foot tends to fall asleep if I'm stood up for too long, but still, glad I give it a shot. Would recommend. In terms of a different style of pacing, however, you'll also discover that Quest Z Doom comes replete with the pre-packaged presence of Brutal Doom. To say that Brutal Doom ups the intensity of gameplay somewhat is kind of akin to saying that water is somewhat wet, and that is only magnified when experienced via the medium of VR. I feel like I made somewhat of a mistake deciding to activate the Hell on Earth starter pack in conjunction with this, but both of them are inexorably linked in my mind when it comes to playing them, so I thought why the heck not. As it turns out, the more complex layouts of the average Hell on Earth starter pack, combined with a lot of the visual clutter that's present, does somewhat tank the performance of what you'll be seeing through the headset. Another aspect that probably works against the experience here is the fact that the enemies within Brutal Doom are much more aggressive, some of them featuring lunging attacks, allowing them to close the distance much more quickly, and when utilizing the same style of movement that got me pretty neatly through episode 1 of Vanilla Doom, you find that it doesn't quite translate as nicely into these particular situations. If anything, it just left me yearning for the swiftness and mobility afforded to me via the good old-fashioned keyboard and mouse, because, let's face it, it was designed around that. And other than the weapon models, there's not really many concessions made here for the VR experience. When it comes to the core central hook of Brutal Doom, however, that of course being the brutality of it all, it still very much has it where it counts. I'd be lying if I said I didn't experience a degree of sadistic glee watching my demonic foes fly apart after being pulverized with high-impact weaponry. For those of you wondering about how glory kills, executions, whatever you want to call them, work here in Brutal Doom, it's pretty much the same as the standard version. Viewed at a third-person remove, you get to witness an animation of Doom Guy ripping and tearing an enemy apart. But in VR, it's especially strange because it essentially pulls you out of what you perceive as your avatar, functionally becoming an extremely violent out-of-body experience. Personally speaking, I prefer the more up-close and personal approach, which can still be achieved here by switching to your hands and just violently fisting the nearest thing you can find. Preferably dead. The living things have a little too much fight in them. And if, against all odds, you somehow get bored after all that, you can always just resort to fisting yourself in the face. Man, I could have phrased a lot of that way better. All in all, if you're expecting to have anything resembling an extensive run with Brutal Doom, doubly so if using the Hell on Earth starter pack, I would actually advise turning that difficulty down lower than you'd normally be comfortable with, because, as I've already mentioned, playing Brutal Doom via VR saddles you with somewhat of a handicap. As a brief aside, I also discovered a few fascinating things about myself, both physically and mentally, during the course of playing Doom in VR. Chief of these was in regards to how I physically held myself for a significant chunk of my initial gameplay. You'll note that the weapon at hand is more often than not present in my vision in the lower right hand corner of the screen. This, as it turns out, is kind of a stressful way to hold yourself, leading to quite a few aches developing in the arm over time. Once I noticed this, I realized it was a consequence of my brain being wired a particular way, because, of course, if the weapon isn't present in a particular corner of my vision, how could it possibly be equipped? How was I possibly expected to defend myself? As you might imagine, like most habits, it took a little bit of a while for me to effectively rewire myself, but eventually I got to the point where my brain was finally comfortable with the idea of letting my arm rest to one side while idly navigating, because, of course, I was only a simple arm movement away from being able to bring my weapon back to bear. Anyway, after trying to slog my way through several levels of the Hell on Earth starter pack with Brutal Doom, I eventually thought, sod it, let's load Russian Overkill instead. The result? Yep. Just as fun as I thought it would be. Sure, the weapons don't have 3D models. Sure, they look a little goofy when you try and rotate them. Does that detract from the overall fun of the experience at all? Hell no. It still delivers exactly what I desire from Russian Overkill, VR or not. Big boom booms make enemies go bye-bye. And let me tell you, when it delivers in bulk. Something that's certainly enhanced by playing this in VR, however, is just the sheer scale of the explosions some of these weapons can produce. Being scale appropriate in an area or environment and just seeing this gargantuan mushroom cloud expand upwards and out is awe-inspiring, to say the least. It's heartening to see that Quest Z Doom itself is capable of hosting this range of moddable experiences within VR. It certainly gives me hope for returning to it in future when I've gotten a bit of a better handle on what's possible with my particular headset, just so I can plug in stuff and see if it works. All in all, I feel like I've made a pretty good call when it comes to indulging my desire to experience VR. It's certainly given me a fresh perspective when it comes to classics such as Doom, and let's face it, I'd be remiss if I ignored the very significant presence of Quake here as well. That is available through side quest. Looking forward to giving that a proper whirl at some point. Not to mention Doom 3.
Jeez. Do you make a habit of sneaking up on people?
Oh,
Everyone's
excuse me.
already-
This is probably the one that I'm most excited to do a deep dive on. It's a little different from the edition that you can experience with Doom 3 BFG edition. This one is via side quest and allows you to do stuff like have full body modeling, so you've got fully modeled arms that you can flap around all over the place like a lunatic. You can physically interact with the touchscreen panels that are present within a level, and quite frankly, it's amazing that this is all just running natively on the headset itself. No tethering required. You can just take it with you wherever you go, and man, I'm really looking forward to doing a full and proper playthrough of this. But yeah, hopefully you'll get to see another video on my experiences, specifically with Doom 3 Quest, at some point down the line. And at the very least, thank you so much for indulging me as I ramble on for about 15 minutes over my experiences within VR. I hope at the very least you found it interesting, and if you've got the opportunity, I'd certainly see if you could borrow yourself a Quest 2 headset. It's one thing to hear someone else talking about it, it's another thing entirely to experience it for yourself. But in the meantime, this has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.